So I did remember to turn off my humidifier today, so you're not going to see all that mist behind me, and I'm doing some shorter hair, so here we go. Propagating is basically breeding your plants. The success of your propagation might vary depending on the type of plant you're propagating and how you're propagating it. So let's talk about some of the most common methods that you would do at home and when you should do them with what plant. So just a little disclaimer before we get too deep into the whole propagation methods is that most plants can be propagated in numerous forms. There's not any rule to which you should propagate your plants. Whatever works for you is the way to do it. As I talk about my experience in propagating in different methods, that's just based off my experience, and it might just give you some ideas or a guide to how you might propagate some of the plants you have at home if you haven't done so before. But there's no legal way of doing things, and if somebody has experience propagating a plant in some type of medium and someone else has a experience in propagating in another type of medium, as long as you get success, more power to you. So you may or may not agree with what I choose to propagate, but that's because this works for me in my climate. Weather has a lot to do with it. The amount of light has a lot to do with it. This is just to be a little inspiration for you. And honestly, trial and error is probably your best way of finding out what's going to work. So let's start with water propagating. So water propagating is when you take a clipping of your plant and you put it directly into a vessel of water. And as the plant acclimates to the water, it will start to grow roots. And as those roots grow, you can either repot them into soil or some other type of medium. And some people even leave the plants directly in water indefinitely. Okay, so with water propagation, my experience has been that it is very successful. And I think some of the pros with this is that it's the most preferred way because it's very easy. You get to actually visibly see roots, which I think that has such a payoff to it, and people really appreciate the process of watching the roots grow. And then besides the fact that it's just so easy, it also tends to be very decorative. You can get really beautiful vases or different water vessels that you can water propagate in, and it becomes a piece of decoration all in itself that doesn't require a lot of eyesoreness. I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but I have some Micans cuttings water propagating in this little jar, and it's pretty inexpensive and easy, and you would see results. Now, some cons with water propagating would be that a lot of plants don't tolerate so much water that you would get rot. I know my experience has been, I have tried water propagating Rhaphidophora tetrasperma cuttings, and they almost instantly rot on me. And then other plants that just need a lot of oxygen or aeration. But what I have had extremely good success in are most types of aeroids, which would include philodendron or monstera or pothos. Syngonium actually water propagate really well for me. Hoya will even water propagate pretty well. I've had really good success with that too. Although there are probably other preferred ways of propagating Hoya, I still find it to be fairly successful in water. And snake plants actually propagate in water very well too. It's very easy to take leaf cuttings of snake plants and just stick them in water, and you get whole new plants coming out. Now, one thing you must also keep in mind with water propagating is that you do need to change the water. Over a period of time, you might see debris or that film that kind of develops on the inside of the bottles, and you would need to clean them to ensure that you're not getting any type of bacteria or anything nasty that you don't want your plants to have. And it could just be unsightly having dirty glass bottles around your home. And you do need to change the water just to also freshen up the nutrients that might be absorbed by the plant, ensuring you're getting fresh oxygen in there. And if you want to leave your plants in water for a period of time, For example, if you want to actually just leave your plants potted in water, you would need to feed the plant in order for the plant to regenerate and grow, because there aren't a lot of nutrients in water. I mean, water is basically hydrogen. I mean, yeah. Water is basically just two elements. You would need to give it some type of plant food or feed it in some sort of way. So that's something else to keep in mind with water propagating or keeping your plants in water indefinitely. Now, another very preferred way of propagating is using moss. Typically, most people use sphagnum moss, which is a very water-retaining material, and because sphagnum moss can be very thick, it also creates a lot of space for air to flow through it too. This would be an example of some sphagnum moss propagating that I have done. This obviously works really great for, I would say, a lot of house plants. Aeroids propagate very well in sphagnum moss, but I also find plants like peperomia, which I have a dish of peperomia here, begonia propagate in sphagnum moss, ceropegia, such as string of hearts, propagate really well in sphagnum moss. Hoya, pilea, Rhaphidophora has actually been very successful in sphagnum moss for myself. It's very water retaining, but allowing extra airflow for plants that appreciate a lot of oxygen around their roots. Now, I have found a lot of the pros for this is that sphagnum has been very highly successful for me. I could put maybe 20 cuttings in a box. I guess you would probably do the math, and I would estimate maybe an 80 to 90% success rate. And it does really well with very high humidity loving plants, because a lot of times you could get plastic containers with lids and place wet sphagnum in there and it would hold its humidity. You could also leave an open container where the sphagnum would dry out faster if you have a plant that needs a rapid drying circulation. But because these are very good for very high humidity plants, this usually would be the preferred method for something like a begonia or say a like African violet or something along those lines. I would also say that sphagnum, although it can be really great for aeroids or other like leaf cuttings, stem cuttings, but like I said, probably your humidity loving plants or plants that need to retain moisture. Now, some cons I might find with sphagnum moss would be it can still introduce rot. Although it might be less likely to rot as it would in water, it is possible for you to have leaf cuttings that rot or maybe the stems rot. So you would want to make sure that your sphagnum is having enough circulation to dry out, or it could also introduce mold, which happens a lot if you're not getting enough air circulation. Also want to keep an eye out for mold. Now, very much along the same lines, a lot of people have had success in propagating in perlite or pumice or vermiculite. Those materials are really great if you need a very well draining medium or something that can retain some water but not as much water as say sphagnum moss will. So if you want to try propagating a succulent leaf or maybe a cactus, I would probably recommend something such as perlite. Now, some of the pros to that is obviously it's an alternative to soil that adds moisture, and it can also make the transition to soil a little bit easier than if you were using something such as sphagnum. But there are cons to propagating in perlite as well. It could also still add mold, which if it doesn't get enough circulation, you could be getting mold developing along the bottoms and sides of your containers. It doesn't offer a lot of nutrients unless you supplement it as well. So very similar to water, after a while the plant would use up all the nutrients that it has, and you would need to supplement with some type of plant food in order to keep the growing going. And the success rate is probably not as high as sphagnum or water, but you will still see some good promising growth from your leaves. Now, the next method of propagating that I'm going to bring up is soil propagating. Now, soil propagating is also probably one of the most common and easiest ways of propagating your plants, and it is very effective for most plants as well. Any type of aeroid can soil propagate, especially if these are plants with aerial roots that can go directly into soil and can start developing a root system. You might also find peperomia or succulents can be soil propagated, although they probably will will grow slower in soil than they would in a sphagnum moss because there is less water retention. It still can have some success. Typically, succulents are propagated in soil because in the wild, the plant will shed leaves and those leaves fall on the ground and will grow into new plants. So if you go with that theory in mind when you're propagating succulents, leaving a leaf along the surface of the soil, it will develop its own roots and have its new growth come out and become a new plant. Soil propagating is really great for cactus because it doesn't retain as much water as, say, a sphagnum moss would. And most cactus actually would prefer to be soil propagated because you would place the cutting directly into the soil and it will start to develop its own roots since it's, closer to how it would be in nature. Now, some of the pros with soil propagating is obviously the transition is non-existent. You're putting your plant directly into soil and it is very easy to leave the plant there and let it grow, and you wouldn't have to transition it to another medium. A lot of soils obviously are very rich in different, nutrients, and so you're able to not have to introduce nutrients. The plants are able to absorb what's in the soil. You wouldn't have to fertilize until the plant is much bigger or until the plant has been in the soil for a significant amount of time. I'm having the hardest time spitting that out. Just words do not come natural to me. And it can be very good for moisture control because obviously soil, it's very easy to control the amount of moisture in it. You would be able to let it dry out for longer periods of time. You would be able to also change the formula of your soil. If you need something more water retaining or if you need something more quick drying, you can alter or amend your soil to the type of plant that you're propagating. So it can have its own benefits when it comes to the flexibility. Now, some of the cons with soil propagating that I have experienced, the success rate for me can be sporadic. You could be having a lot of moisture retaining at the bottom of your container and be dry on top, and mentally you might think that the plant needs more water when it's already kind of sitting in soggy soil at the bottom. So I think one of the things to be very careful of with soil propagating too, again, is just understanding the proportions of plant to soil. If you have more soil than plant, keep in mind it's going to hold water a lot longer. And if you have more plant to soil, it's going to dry out faster. And I have also experienced soil to probably take the longest when it comes to propagating. I've seen several examples of people testing different propagation methods with different plants, and you see some plants have rooted much faster in water or sphagnum moss, and although the roots are very substantiated in soil as well, they might not be as prolific as some of the other methods. Although I would also find it to be more secure because, again, there's very little transition necessary. The roots are established. You probably would have a more healthy or sustainable plant if you propagate in soil, but it might be just growing a little bit slower than some of those other methods. I really find succulents and cactus to be the best plants to propagate in soil, aeroids as well, but I usually would want to have aeroids that already have established roots. Now, another propagation method I'll kind of talk about briefly is air layering. And air layering is where you will create a bundle of moisture around the center of a stem. This works really good for aeroids that have aerial roots, and it's also probably the preferred method for ficus because ficus tend to be a little picky when it comes to propagation. I have seen a lot of people have very high success rate with air layering ficus plants. Now, some of the pros to air layering is that if it's unsuccessful, you won't see that much damage to the plant. You might get a little bit of rot here or there, but it can be very minimal and you won't have taken a cutting and the cutting just died on you. It does take up less space. You have less vessels or containers lying around your house, so it can also be a space saver. And then some of the cons to that would be the challenge of keeping moisture. You have either paper towels or sphagnum or whatever can dry out over time, and trying to retain that moisture if it's not sealed correctly can be a little bit of a challenge. Now, division is also a very secure way of propagating your plants, and that is a very successful way of propagating Dracaena/Sansevieria, let's just say your snake plants, your Aglaonemas, your succulents, bromeliads, or any type of plant that gives off offshoots or pups that you can divide from the mother plant and plant it in its own vessel or pot, whatever you want to plant it in. And division obviously is very easy to get a full-sized or established plant with roots, and you have little to no weight. But it can potentially, why can't I say that word? Okay, I give up. Damage your roots. So one thing to keep in mind is because you are essentially pulling your plant apart, you want to be very careful when it comes to dividing the roots that you're not causing damage to those roots. But it is probably the most instant way of getting a new plant. Flowering plants can be a challenge in itself. Not all tropical plants are very prone to flowering. Oh my god. So if you were able to successfully get your plants to flower and then breeding those and actually pollinating them, it might be something you would do on a larger scale greenhouse situation, but doing so in your own home can be rather challenging. You might just want to go buy seeds at your local store. But if you're up to the challenge, I would highly recommend doing some research on how to do that because it is a very involved process. But I'm sure the satisfaction of success would probably be worth all that work too. And then I didn't mention at the beginning of the video, but there's always tissue culture, which again is very much like breeding via seed and is a very scientific process. And I'm sure when you Google tissue culture, you will see exactly what I mean. And that is when it is done in a lab environment where you are actually taking cellular tissue from the plant and using a hormone treatment to breed it and develop new plants. It has a very high yield, and if done correctly in a scientific sterile situation can actually produce some pretty great results. So I hope I answered some questions you might have had about propagating, especially if you're new to the plant game and you're just starting to propagate your plants for the first time. But maybe this will give you some directions and some hints and clues on how to get started breeding your plants. And hopefully by the end of summer, you will have some beautiful new plants and we can share, because why not? Let's share. But thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you all for being here, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!